Do you consider yourself a high achiever? Smart, driven, highly successful? I am so excited to have you. My name is Julia Arndt and I'm the host of the Stress Podcast. I will help you develop your stress resilience the same way you've developed your workplace superpowers. Learn peak performance tools to thrive at work and in your personal life. Let's get started. And welcome back to the Stress Podcast. I am super excited to welcome two wonderful guests to the show today. And it's Kirsten and Tiffany from the Relationship Recovery. Hi, you two. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. It's been a busy but productive Monday and it feels good. How about you guys?
It's been good. Same.
Yeah, same.
Just got off of a retreat that we just hosted for our clients. So we're just getting back in the swing of things. It's always fun to kind of mix it up.
Yeah, nice. Kirsten and Tiffany, I am really excited to have you on the show today because I want to talk with you, obviously, about relationships. And before we jump into all of the things, the first question that I always ask my guests is, where are you located? What time is it? And what have you been up to this morning? So maybe let's start with Tiffany.
So we are located in Bountiful, Utah, and it's just a little after 4 p.m. here, and our day has been full of client calls today. So it's been a great day.
Nice. Are you doing all the client calls together?
We do some together, and then we each have individual clients. So it just depends. Today's been a lot of celebrating, because a lot of our clients that were at our retreat, we also had today. So that's been fun to celebrate the weekend with them.
Amazing. Wonderful. So tell us a little bit more about the relationship recovery and how that all started. And I'd love to understand a little bit your backgrounds as well. So what were you maybe up to before you started the relationship recovery, and how did it lead into doing the work that you're doing today?
Sure. So the relationship recovery, we focus on relationship turmoil and toxicity and like helping people navigate that. When we originally started, it was all about like divorce and romantic relationships. But as it's grown, it's all sorts of relationships. We have clients that are from the workplace. Like that's where their relationship started and they were trying to navigate it there. And what we find is typically there's patterns in relationships, in all of their relationships, that's similar things that they're trying to navigate, and started even back in childhood and moves forward, right? So we help with relationship patterns breaking. And really yes, what brings you in is typically a relationship externally, be that has caused it, or at least shown you there's something going on. But really, we try to help people navigate back to recovering the relationship with themselves.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. So let's take a moment to really introduce yourselves. I'd love to just get some personal introductions and hear your background. Kirsten, why don't you start?
Okay. So I'm Kirsten Franklin. I'm the co-founder of the Relationship Recovery. I am also a mom of 3 children, which I absolutely love. And I'm remarried now, and I've done a lot of that because of a lot of the work that I've done. And it's how I ended up back in that relationship. It's also caused me I was actually in the relationship when we started the relationship recovery because of everything I took from my past relationships. I hadn't really figured out that, and I didn't have a lot of resources. That's actually what brought me there to the relationship recovery. That was kind of my mission coming in, is I noticed that this relationship turmoil had caused things it was really bringing damage into my healthy, quote unquote, healthy relationship at the time. And I didn't want to mess something up there. And then, that all the onions and layers go that way. I'm a certified life coach. My background is social media marketing. I've also done coaching for people with social media marketing. And in my other life, you'd kind of asked about our other life.
Yeah.
We actually met at our previous job, Tiffany and I. So we can kind of dive into that if you want to. That's where we met. I was running social media marketing and kind of over database marketing there. And she was over events, and we took our strengths and put them together, and also our passion around the turmoil, because we both walked through divorce, and shared that. So anyways, it's hopefully that's kind of what you were looking for, but
Yes, it's awesome.
a little bit of me.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Kirsten. Tiffany.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Tiffany Denny, and I am mom to 4 boys and 1 daughter, and Nana to 9. We just had our 9th grandbaby. And we're obviously a blended family, so we're a big blended family. But yeah, like Kirsten said, we met at our previous job. I think what was really important for me is that I'd been through a very long marriage and a really difficult divorce. And it seemed like I would talk to people and they just didn't understand. They didn't understand. And we didn't find the resources and the help that we were looking for. So we decided that we would create that for other people, because we know how hard it is to walk through these situations. And, divorce itself is hard, but then you take and you put on top of that, like a personality disorder, and it can be it's just extremely hard. It's extremely difficult. And when people don't understand it or have never walked it, it's hard to get support from them. And so we've created a community that can support people. And like Kirsten said, it's branched out to so many more things than what it started out as, which has been really, really cool for us to be able to reach thousands of people and help people in all sorts of situations because, we have to face it. Our life is just completely about relationships, whether it's,
Totally.
personal relationships in the workforce, those kind of things. So.
Yeah. And what I find really interesting is you mentioned personality disorders. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like kind of the combination of maybe difficult relationships with personality disorder?
Sure.
What can we understand under personality disorder?
Well, and so before we go into that, I also want to just stress, somebody doesn't need to be diagnosed for you to have an issue. Like sometimes we get really hung up on, oh, I'm not valid. So I just want to kind of put that, I don't know, disclosure there or little
For
thought,
sure.
because sometimes we get so hung up on that. But with that being said, also, we don't diagnose, treat, or cure. We are certified coaches and 2 people that have walked with it. Just walked in these relationships and toxicity, but informing yourself around like cluster B personality disorders is important, because these personality disorders are more common than people may think, especially from the experience we've seen with the clients we work with. It's there. And the ones that we really talk about frequently are things like narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder is the full piece. Some people call it NARC. You'll see those type of things on TikTok, right? I think there's NARC TikTok and things like that. Our president here in the United States, that was like a big that was kind of a catalyst for a lot of conversation around personality disorders. Politics, you'll always find things like that. Like people are always accusing people of, narcissism and things like that. And it's good because it's creating conversation. It does sometimes throw it. So people are throwing things like casually out. So sometimes we get so hung up on the diagnosis that it's actually damaging, but it's there. It's important. Borderline is another one that we hear quite frequently. It's a lot of that cluster B. So if you look it up, you can Google, there's DSM information about that. Again, we don't diagnose, treat, or cure. However, being informed, the information's there, and it's important to know these things because personality disorders play a role in toxic relationships and can cause relationship turmoil. Also, though, other things can cause that too, and traits, and people end up with personality disorders because of their trauma and your trauma. And so it's so much, there's more complexity to it. So don't get hung up on it, but I still think it's important to be informed.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. And when did you officially establish the relationship recovery? When did you start?
I believe we started officially. We've been doing things for a couple of years prior, but on the books, I believe in 2016 is right.
Yeah. January 2018 is when our launch was, but we started doing things in 2016.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's according to the paperwork or whatever you want to look at it officially. But yeah, that's when we started.
Very cool. And you have thousands of followers nowadays. And yeah, it's really interesting to see kind of all of the content that you're giving out. And it's really interesting you say that you have that kind of social media background, because it really reflects as well in how you're managing the accounts. So it's really awesome to see. Cool. Let's dive a little bit into workplace toxic relationships. Where do we start? What is, I think what I hear a lot, obviously, as a coach as well, working mostly with corporate clients and self-employed people, that they are kind of blaming their external environment and external like people that they're working with as a reason for them burning out and feeling stressed and feeling overwhelmed. How do you start working with people that come to you with a problem like that?
I mean, when somebody comes with that, and there's so many different pieces, just like that's such a loaded aspect. Like, I would assume, just based off of that little sample, it would be like, you may need to look into things like codependency. Like, are you crossing the line with that person? Like, are you taking it on? Are you totally draining yourself to the point that the company or your boss and what they think, you care more about that than you care about what you actually need? And then boundaries are an issue.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I hear just based off that. And that's super common. We hear that all the time. Really blurred lines, treating a company like it has a soul. Not that you shouldn't take pride in your work, but when you're totally self-sacrificing to the point that you're burned out, that's a problem, right? Like, you're crossing lines. I can say too, also from experience, and I'll let Tiffany speak for herself, I've done that. I've been there because I'm an achiever, and a lot of my value comes from work. I mean, it used to. I've definitely learned how to manage that, but that's where I sought value. And I think that also causes an issue if you're not having, you haven't really helped that relationship with yourself, because and your work is the only place where you're seeking kind of that high. It's a hit. And that's why people become like addicted to work. Like, it's a very real thing.
I would agree 100% with the codependency piece and the boundary piece, and really recognizing that the environment might be toxic and it might warrant a change, right? But for the time being, when you're in there, and if there's not a way that you can maneuver yourself out, and you need to work there, it's important that you work on yourself here so that you can get strong enough to create those boundaries and to not have those codependent behaviors. I think it's just extremely important, because so much of that environment can be like that, because it is so competitive. And I would agree too with the self-worth piece, really hustling for your worth. And it kind of is a culture that teaches us that that's where that comes from, right?
Yeah, totally. So like deep dive into this question, because I think this is really interesting, is how do you really identify if it is a toxic workplace, right? Because I think oftentimes maybe this label has become a little bit like burnout has become kind of like easy to put on, like, oh, it's a toxic environment. Like, if people are listening and they might either think totally my workplace is toxic and it isn't, or vice versa. How would you describe, or like what would be maybe indicators to say that's really kind of toxic and not good for you?
I would say it's got to come a little bit from how you feel. Like, I mean, I know for me, I've worked at places when I've walked in the door, it just does not feel good to me. It doesn't feel good. Also, observing what people within that company do. I mean, is there a lot of, backstabbing and conversations behind closed doors that don't need to be behind closed doors? I would just like be very aware of what your surroundings look like.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I would just, sorry if it went in and out.
No, that's great.
I would just add that with that, it's like just what Tiffany said, if it doesn't feel good, that intuitive piece is so crucial. I just would reinforce that. If it doesn't feel good to you, that's toxic enough. Like, If you feel like you're being attacked, or you feel unsafe, or it's not in line with your values, somebody's pressuring you, it feels off. Like that feeling is so crucial. That's when things start. That's toxicity, right? Like if it doesn't feel in line for you and something doesn't feel good, then that's where it is. And the thing about it is, when we're like in a low energy state, you're not going to be in touch with your intuition. So that's when you're going to be more prone to things. And in a workplace that's draining you physically and emotionally and everything else, it's easy to slip into those toxic relationships and then also stay there because you're already being drained.
Yes, you're bringing up a super important point in terms of just like when you're already having high stress and high adrenaline and high cortisol, you're more in an emotional state versus a rational state. And then you're seeing those relationships maybe more toxic than they might even be. And that's kind of my next question, because I experienced burnout in 2018. And definitely looking back, I felt like things were toxic, but honestly, I think it was more, now obviously with a lot of perspective and a lot of learnings, I feel like it was almost more a representation of how I felt, of, you know, how burned out I was. And I just kind of, it was just kind of a mirror reflecting back to me, or I almost, you know, felt threatened because I was in that fight or flight state all the time, and I was in this high stress state all the time. I felt threatened by people, even though I don't think that they had that intention. It was just kind of how, like, my perception and observation at the time. So when people are kind of maybe feeling more kind of aligned with that message, like more like, you know, even at first, obviously creating just that awareness of, oh, this is maybe just more me and reflecting how I'm currently internally feeling, than maybe someone that's doing something wrong with me, right? Because we were just talking about how to identify toxic workplace. Maybe it's not a toxic workplace, but the way of how you feel, you perceive it as that. What would be the next step then that a person can take in order to kind of get out of that cycle, or not get into more toxic relationships?
Well, I think you just said it. I mean, in some ways, you have to identify what the source is. What is it? Is it a person? Like, you just like, because you did just say the other flip. I mean, there's other sides to the coin, right? It could be like, is it me in the mirror? Is it the situation? Is it that I'm am I self-abandoning? Am I doing something I don't actually love, and that's creating this toxic behavior? Which I would dare to say, if you go back in time, some of these trends probably existed way before what's going on in the workplace. You know, it starts typically as frequently as it's thrown out, but it probably started somewhere in childhood, probably started in your other relationships. And then all of that is compounded. And then your role that you've taken in those other relationships, you're taking to work too, in your work relationships and how you're handling things. So I think it's important to really figure out, okay, this feels off. I'm seeing some patterns. What is it? Identifying where it's coming from. Like you said, is it yourself? Is it another person? Is it that is it me in the mirror? Is it the situation? And then going from there, I think that's kind of your first place.
And maybe a second place to go from there, because I think what happens when we get, we're just trying to manage our survival sometimes, right? When we feel like we're in fight or flight all the time. So a lot of times what we'll have our clients do is take a step back and do a little bit of reflection on what's going on with them. And so there's some good questions you can sit back and ask yourself, things that you haven't really thought about probably for a long time. And the first one we always suggest is ask yourself, what makes you come alive? And then the second one is, what are your strengths? And then the third one is, what do you best contribute to the world? Because when we can ask ourselves these and we can write them down, it can change our perception on what's going on, right? It can help bring clarity so that we can take a step back and go, oh, this isn't really serving me. This position is draining me. And either I need to change some stuff on my side and like infuse some things back into my life so that I can come out of that fight or flight, or I need to make a change. But it'll bring some clarity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love those questions. Thanks for sharing them.
Awesome.
Codependency in the workplace. I've not really ever heard about that before. I've obviously heard about codependency. Can you explain maybe what codependency, how that's defined, and then how we can also find that in the workplace?
Do you want to define codependency and then I can give some examples or?
Sure. So codependency is a little tough to define. That's
Okay.
if you look at all the research that's out there, it's a little tough. But basically, it comes in a few different forms. People pleasing is a big one, and rescuing is a big one, and rescuing and saving, I guess, would be a big one. But what happens is we end up caring more about something than someone else does. And so we take it upon ourselves to, fix that person or fix that, whatever it is, we take it upon ourselves to do that. It's just us caring and sacrificing our needs for the needs of somebody else. So definitely it happens in the workplace.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, people pleasing, big thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And there's even two types of codependency too, which is kind of interesting. I mean, typically it is the people pleasing. And that's usually the one when somebody's talking about codependency, that's what they're talking about. And I think it's also important to note when you're talking about the codependency, it's excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner is what they usually say, or on another. But I would open that up to another person or your job in general. Like we tend to, I don't know if you see this a lot. I mean, you're talking about corporate world all the time, but I've experienced this in my own life where I've actually turned almost a company or my job into a human where I'm almost like so dependent upon it that it's where I'm that excessive and emotional and psychological reliance is that, and I mean, it's a thing. It's not even, I mean, it's a combination of people. It's a combination of lots of different things, but I was expecting that from it. And I almost cared about it more than anything else. I've been in the corporate workplace where I treated it better than I ever treated myself. And that right there is codependency. Right. And so you have that version. It also can present too sometimes where it can be confused for narcissism, which I think it's interesting that it can be such a different side of it where it may act and you felt like where somebody may act self-centered in a way. It might be easily, and like I said, can be easily confused with narcissism. But I think the one to really concentrate on is the people pleasing and the caretaking, because the other one usually doesn't affect that person as much. It usually just like narcissism, it affects the people around as more than themselves. I mean, obviously it impacts them, but when you're thinking of codependency, especially in the workplace, I would say it's the people pleasing and the caretaking, like Tiffany said. But I just think it's important to be well informed of there's lots of different ways that codependency shows up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
sorry, Tiffany.
Oh, no, I did not mean to interrupt. Sorry.
No, I thought you had something else to say.
I was just going to say it, you can look at it as though, maybe you're out doing something with your family and something work related comes up and you drop everything with your family to take care of that. Right. So that looks like I'm going to take care of this problem because I care about it more than, rather than finding solutions that maybe you could pass it off to somebody else, we just drop it, like everything right there for work. That would be what codependency would look like. Or an example of it.
Yeah. And so now again, once you have identified that, what would be something that people can do when they are like, oh God, I'm a total people pleaser. So there is definitely some form of codependency happening in my workplace. Where can people start getting out of that?
Well, I like to think of it's important to know where it came from. Because, and let me just give you a little bit of an example. Like, I think like superheroes are a great example of people that are codependent. Like, if you think of like Batman, like I hope you don't care that I'm using this, but I think it's such a great analogy. Okay. I have little boys and I also am a huge Batman fan, but he is like so codependent, and he goes and like thinks he's rescuing the world. And we do that in our workplace too. Like we'll like think we're like rescuing and we're going to do this thing. And at the end of the day, like sometimes people aren't even asking for it, or they are, and we're like totally self-abandoning. And like he totally self-abandons. He has no relationships, right? Like he just, now the city's dependent on him, and he's just trying to get this he's trying to get his worth from saving the city. Or in other ways that he does it is he's not even asked for it, and he just shows up and blows up the city, right? And it's like he saved the city, but it's in like flames, like you always see those memes, like this is what it looks like when Batman comes in and saved the city. But you have that piece. So, but if you look at Batman, he started with like his parents were murdered, and like that's his whole story. And so I think and that plays into why he does what he does, right? We're no different. So if you can go back in time and look at where your story is, where did codependency come from? Like, where do you feel like it originates from? It might be like your parent did it, and so you copied them. They were always people pleasing, so you also became a people pleaser. Or sometimes it's like you had somebody that you really wanted to be accepted by, or a parent that was volatile, or a culture that was very much promoting it. Because the interesting thing about codependency is it can start in childhood, and typically does, but it can also be developed in other relationships as an adult. Or maybe pieces of it wouldn't have been as big if you wouldn't have ended up in relationships that reinforced it. I mean, it can come from lots of different places. So I think the first thing is identify where it came from, right? Like awareness is important so that you can look for the trend.
Yeah.
And then I mean, there's a lot more than that too. I mean, that's just the first step.
Yeah. And what would be the next step?
What do you think?
The next step, I think it's important that you identify your negative behaviors and your coping skills. Getting all of that more in the forefront so that you can start, changing that kind of stuff. But I think really prioritizing self-care is huge, is pouring into yourself, whatever that may be. But when we can take care of ourselves, when we are focused on taking care of ourselves, we're not so hyper focused on taking care of others, right? Caretaking is great. It's great to take care of people. But when it crosses the line of codependency, then it becomes really unhealthy for you, right? And the other person, actually. It's not good for that other person for you to try and manage things when, it's just like Kirsten's Batman analogy. People aren't typically asking for his help. He's just stepping in and doing it, right? But, so keeping the balance there of, it's okay for me to take care of people. It's not okay for me to do it at my own expense. So focusing, a high focus on self-care, and then a lot of mindfulness, being very mindful is super important.
Yeah. And I love that, it kind of always goes back to the same thing. So I have a model that I created, to help peak performers sustain their performance, and self-care and setting boundaries is part of that. And I think everything is so interconnected. And for me, it's really just interesting and powerful that the same topics come up over and over and over again. So if you can manage that part, and if you can master these tools, it applies in so many different areas of your life. And it can help you so much. I was speaking at an event at the end of March, and I was sharing a little bit about my own story. I don't even know anymore how it came up, but I was sharing how important it was for me during my childhood to please especially my dad with like good grades, and to get from him this like recognition and appreciation for that I'm a good girl, and that I'm a kind of a successful person. And how I then kind of translated that relationship, because I felt like I never got enough of that maybe attention from my dad, how I basically brought that into the workplace, right? And then reflected that onto my manager or onto my leader, and like look and constantly try to look for for their appreciation and their recognition. Obviously, you know, in like in apostrophes, like killed myself in order to get that, right? And you talked a little bit about that as well, Kristen, of like that self-worth, like how much it is attached just to that external recognition, and that we're making our own personal value so much dependent on what other people think of us and what other people tell us. I'm kind of curious, how did you get out of it? Like, obviously awareness is always the first thing, right? We are aware that that's happening, but was there something that clicked for you, or something where you were like, oh, this is what I'm doing, and kind of taking a specific step towards getting out of that mindset?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a realization that I was doing it right. I had to have something that outweighed that, because I mean, right. So just backing up kind of to you said your story, right? Like you figured out that it was attached to your dad and some of that, and there's no shame. And sometimes we have trouble when we're coming up with these stories, we like shame our parents, and it doesn't need to look like that. It can just, and I mean, obviously there's abusive circumstances. I'm not excusing that piece, but like typically they're good intended, right? Like there wasn't any harm.
Yeah.
Right?
They were doing their best. Exactly.
Yeah, they're doing the
100%.
best.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But whether we like it, you would be the most perfect parent, and there's still going to be things your kids interpret, right? Like it's just the way it is. So having that story, knowing where it came from, the other piece, like for me from that, like A, awareness, B, the other thing is, what are these negative behaviors, and identifying these core beliefs of what it was I was gaining from it. Like, what am I saying to myself? What are these pieces? So like it would create this toxicity, and then I would notice it, and I noticed what I was gaining from staying in it too. Right. Like, so I was the favorite person. So for me, so this goes way back. So I almost, when I was in this workplace, I was also coming out of a toxic relationship. So I like to joke that, I mean, not joke, but kind of seriously, this is what happened. I was in a toxic romantic relationship, and typically people keep their dating trends, right? Mm-hmm. Mine went from this toxic relationship. I took those same behaviors because even though I wasn't necessarily the cause, you take on the role of the person receiving the other side of it, right? So if you're with a person that has negative traits, you have to take on the role of the person receiving the negative traits, and that's what you continue to attract. And I took that same aspect into the workplace. I mean, it existed before, but I would definitely say it amplified into the workplace that I had. But once I was able to kind of identify that I was treating my workplace like I was my relationship, and started working on myself, like the traits, because the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. Mm-hmm. And so all of my value, because I was seeking externally for all of my value, and that came from my workplace. So when I was able to identify that I was getting all of my worth and value and kudos and feeling good about myself from my workplace.
Yes. So we're talking about, relate kind of how you are taking on these traits, and then kind of get them amplified in other areas of your life as well.
Yeah. So I just noticed that a lot of the same negative traits in my romantic relationships, and in other, even like talk in friendships, because the way you do, like I said, the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And I was doing the same thing with my workplace. I was seeking external validation. If I failed at work, I felt like I failed as a human. If I, and it was an addiction. I was addicted to this validation I was getting from work. And it was funny because the workplace I had was not that, there was really positive things, but there were also like some toxic pieces where I felt like I never could quite please the circumstance either. So it very much mirrored the romantic relationship I was in.
Interesting.
So when I was able to start finding worth not externally, and more doing my own work and figure out why I was doing what I was doing, I just naturally didn't make sense anymore. I wanted different things because it wasn't in alignment with who I had become. And And so I was able to break that. It actually happened a little faster than I thought. I found something that outweighed it, right? My want to be with my kids more, my want to, build another business, which funny enough, Tiffany and I actually were trying to build a different business. And then our passion for this came first, and then that actually outweighed. It's funny how you just take these baby steps and then you're able to do that. But I would say that was kind of the big thing, was I was able to quit trying to find my worth from my work and turn inward. And that's why I was able to break it, because it just didn't make sense anymore. I'd have to self-abandon in order to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, another thing that I would notice is that I would bring that negativity or that toxicity home with me.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the topic of the conversation, with my husband and I. And that kind of started to create a little bit of a rub too. I mean, he didn't want to hear about it. And I was sick of listening to myself about it too. So I think that's something to observe is, what is this doing to my life as a whole? And I think you can really pull it apart and see, and take a look at it and see, is it just something I need to change here? And then like you said, you were able to look back in 2018 and you're like, no, it was more about me and the things I needed to change. Because if it is, and you start working on yourself, it will naturally change and it will be okay. Or is it something I really need to remove myself from because it's just not good for me, no matter how much work I do here?
Yeah, I love all of that. I think it's such a valuable topic. And I think one of the things that they always say is, one thing that really resonated with me over the years was that, if you change yourself, your external environment will change as well. I think so often we think the external environment needs to change, and it's so much easier to blame and to be like, this environment has to change, or the workplace has to change, or this person has to change, and then I will feel so much better, right? But oftentimes it's so much more about our own perception and how we are viewing things. And then when we actually start to do the work on ourselves, it is again kind of reflected from our external environment then as well. The last question, and a huge topic that I'm kind of gonna open up, but something that resonates really deeply with me is you both talked about divorce and about how difficult that was and how much you learned through that. And I broke off an engagement in 2020, 1 year into building my own business, and it was a huge trauma for me and big heartbreak, and super difficult to navigate as I was building a business and as my business actually started to become busier and busier. During the time, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about my own experience too, but during your time going through that, how did you navigate that with your workplace? Because I think, we are obviously, when we are, toxic relationships or relationships in general are difficult, right? They can be really difficult in the workplace. They can be really difficult in our personal lives. How do you make sure that you're not bringing one or the other into the other world, right? So if you have a toxic relationship in your personal life, how do you make sure that you're kind of setting that boundary? And maybe even how do you set that boundary with maybe in the workplace, or vice versa? Like when you have a toxic relationship in the workplace, how do you not bring that home?
That's a difficult one. Kirsten and I had a unique situation because we worked at the same place. I had just gone through a divorce. And I was about a year out of it, and she was just starting to go through divorce. I would say, it's important that you talk to the right people. So, keeping it so that you can find the right help and the right support. So whether that's a therapist or a coach, so that you have a place to talk about it. Because yes, I mean, if our situation didn't look the way it did, it was easy for us to talk to each other. But say we didn't have each other and we're trying to talk to different people there, you can see how hard that would be to keep it in a place where it wasn't just, invading your work, and vice versa. So I would say making sure that you have the right people to talk to or the right support system, and making sure you're able to keep it there. Because I have been in a situation before where I was going through my divorce at a different job, and I actually had to step out of that job because he was coming to my work and it was making it an unsafe place for people. And so, and they didn't, and for me to be able to talk to, other coworkers there wasn't a safe thing to do. So, just really keeping it to a place of being able to talk to somebody that's outside of the workplace. And I think that helps at home as well, right?
Yeah. And I would just say, I mean, if you want, I'm happy to share. I actually did it wrong.
Please share.
I did
think
it
we
wrong
can learn a lot
at that
from that,
time.
right?
Yeah, no, I think totally, because I mean, when I was going through it, I didn't know. And so I'm sure people can relate to that too. I went wrong. Like I did not handle that right. So learning from that, because I buried myself in work. I got addicted to it, like almost like I treated it like it's how I numbed out. I worked beyond hours than I should have. I created this, I buried myself in it while I was going through a divorce. That was my like drug of choice, so to speak. Like I numbed myself with work, and that's not healthy either. And like Tiffany said, instead of using this as like a coping mechanism, because I think people do use work that way. They can. Sure. And I totally did. I would encourage people to, like Tiffany said, go to the right places, talk the right way, do the right things. Like she was saying, because you can go the wrong way easily with it, and in different ways. Like you can bring it to work and that makes people uncomfortable, or you can, like I said, I just lost myself in it and buried myself in it to the point that, I really regretted it later, because I feel like it numbed me out to the good things too. Cause I wasn't just going through a divorce. I had other things. So I wish I would have had resources, like, which is what we try to provide now, because I didn't find those. I found the wrong coping mechanism, and it was work. So my advice would be, like she said, find ways to cope with it besides work, so that it doesn't come in sideways, whether it's using it to numb out, or like she said, bringing it to work and then it's making other people uncomfortable, or, whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking as well, like now looking again, reflecting back on that a little bit and looking back at like a year and a half ago. And I think I managed it fairly well in the sense that work was actually a welcome distraction at the time, because it was so heavy emotionally. And then, I think I really forced myself to both. I forced myself to like keep on working and focus on my work that was so important to me, and at the same time also be totally okay with, having kind of emotional episodes and not being able to work sometimes, and just be like, okay, I just got to take a self-care day. I just got to take, half the day off or the rest of the day off, or the morning off, because things would come up and I would just need that time to process things. I feel like I had to process so much stuff emotionally that I felt like I was already mentally drained by just kind of that part. So that really helped me. And, to kind of find that, like I always told myself, it's a balance. And, I, found, the okayness in taking time for myself. And I also forced myself to work to distract myself from not just be sitting in those emotions, because I think it is important to sit in it. And it's important also to, to just obviously keep your life going and move forward. Because that's, as hard as it is at the time, it's the most powerful thing to do when you're experiencing a difficult relationship, no matter if it is in the workplace or at home. And yeah, it's good experiences. But I think, we can always learn from these different things, and they just make us stronger. Yeah.
100%. And that's the beauty of it. I'm so glad you said that, because that's what we try to tell our clients. No matter what type of relationship it is, that can be a catalyst to something beautiful. And then they can say things. We actually said this at our retreat this weekend, wow, how is this my life? Like, and it can be different tones, right? Like when you're going through a toxic time or burnout or hard thing, you can be like, wow, how is this my life? Right? Like it's just, and we want them to get to a place like, wow, this is my life. I'm so happy for that experience because it got me here. And the tone can change. you know.
Yeah, totally. And I think the most important thing, and you mentioned that as well, was really the self-love and the self-worth, like creating that and not making that dependent on that external person, right? And not seeking that from someone else, but finding it more within yourself, I think was the most difficult thing, obviously, to do. And to learn, but then it's the most rewarding one as well, because then you're starting to get that from yourself and you don't need that anymore. Obviously we still need it because, you know, our, like, as you said at the beginning of the podcast, our whole life evolves around relationships and we're social beings and we want to connect, and we, you know, there's no life without other people around you, but it's equally as important to be good with yourself.
Absolutely.
How can people best connect with you if they're interested to work with you?
So you can go to therelationshiprecovery.com. We also have a podcast called the Relationship Recovery Podcast, and we are on Instagram, TikTok, and pretty much all things social media. We're also on YouTube, all under @therelationshiprecovery.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited that we got to talk about this super important topic and to share it out with the world. And obviously, hopefully we just planted some seeds and, you know, tackled some topics that might be important for people right now. And if they want to learn more, I'd highly encourage them to go to your Instagram because it's awesome. And they will learn a lot through that in the process. So thank you so much, Kirsten and Tiffany, to be here today.
Thank you.
And I wish you all the best for the future.
Same to you.
Thank you.